That morning in the Bronx did not feel like an ending. It felt unfinished. There were deals still moving, calls unanswered, messages left unread. And a man who had spent his life fixing problems for everyone else was suddenly gone. Chris Lighty was never the loudest voice in the room. He did not rap. He did not chase cameras. He stood behind the curtain, quietly shaping careers that defined a generation. When artists were angry, Chris calmed them. When contracts were confusing, Chris translated them. When money was on the table, Chris made sure it stayed there. That is why the official story shocked so many. Suicide, authorities said. Case closed. But for those who knew him, the explanation felt too small for a life this complex. A man who had survived street violence, industry betrayals, lawsuits, financial losses, and public pressure did not fit neatly into a single conclusion. Friends spoke of plans already made. Family spoke of questions never answered. And 50 Cent said something that still echoes years later. When Chris Lighty died, the brain behind everything died with him. So what really happened when the doors closed that morning? Was this the breaking point of a man who carried too much for too long? Or was the truth lost in a rush to move on? This is not just a story about death. It is a story about power, pressure, and the man who held hip-hop together from the shadows. Long before power, Chris Lighty learned something more important than money. He learned responsibility. Born on May 8, 1968, in the Bronx, Chris was the oldest of 6 children. When his parents separated, childhood ended early. At just 6 years old, he became the man of the house. Watching siblings. Making sure nothing went wrong. Learning that if something broke, it was on him to fix it. His mother believed discipline and education were the only way out. She enrolled him in a private school, placing him in an environment where he stood out immediately. The only black student. The target. Fighting became routine. Not for pride. For survival. Those early years shaped how Chris moved through the world. Calm under pressure. Alert at all times. Always prepared for confrontation. Outside the classroom, the Bronx was creating something new. Hip-hop was not an industry yet. It was an outlet. Park jams. Turntables connected to streetlight poles. Music loud enough to drown out sirens. Chris watched closely. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted control. After high school, he chose stability. Electrical engineering. A job with Metro North. Good money. Benefits. Predictability. On paper, it was a safe future. But Chris was never built for comfort. At night, he gravitated toward the clubs. The places where DJs decided what people heard and who mattered. That is where he met DJ Red Alert. Chris approached him confidently, offering protection and logistics in exchange for access. Red Alert knew the story Chris told was exaggerated. What mattered was his seriousness. Chris and his crew handled security. Carried vinyl crates. Controlled crowds. Problems disappeared when they were around. The group became known as the Violators. Not a brand yet. A reputation. Chris earned the nickname. Baby Chris. Smaller than the others. Quieter. But fearless. He was known as a fighter, yet he rarely escalated situations unnecessarily. He understood balance. Force when needed. Control always. That balance caught Red Alert's attention. When Jungle Brothers needed structure on the road, Chris was chosen. He became their road manager. Not because he was famous. Because he was reliable. He handled money. Travel. Schedules. Security. Mistakes were minimized. Profits increased. Soon, others followed. De La Soul. Then A Tribe Called Quest. Chris wasn't writing lyrics, but his name appeared in them. Not as a star. As someone who mattered. By the late 1980s, the Native Tongues movement was thriving. Artists were free. Creative. Experimental. Behind the scenes, Chris Lighty was learning the mechanics of power. How tours made money. How contracts trapped artists. How chaos could be structured. The streets taught him how to survive. The road taught him how to lead. And the industry was about to teach him how to dominate. Power did not arrive loudly for Chris Lighty. It settled in quietly, through trust. When Liar Cohen invited Chris to join Rush Management, it was not about glamour. It was about proximity to real decision-making. Chris hesitated at first. His early encounters with the executive world felt chaotic, unfocused, and reckless. Too many egos. Too little structure. But Chris understood leverage. To control outcomes, you had to sit where contracts were signed. Inside Rush Management, he became indispensable. While others relied on instinct, Chris relied on paperwork. He read contracts no one else wanted to read. He noticed clauses artists never understood. He learned where money leaked and how to stop it. This is where street discipline met corporate literacy. Then came the incident that forced a permanent shift. In 1989, while attending Queen Latifah's birthday party in Manhattan, Chris was slashed across the face during a confrontation outside the club. Violence followed. The kind of chaos he had lived around for years. Afterward, Liar Cohen gave him a choice. Leave the street life behind, or leave the industry. Chris chose permanence. From that moment forward, his name carried weight. He began managing artists directly. LL Cool J trusted him during a critical comeback phase. Busta Rhymes relied on his guidance. Foxy Brown became one of the most visible female rappers of the era under his watch. Behind the scenes, Chris made introductions that changed careers. He connected Foxy with a young writer named Jay-Z, long before Jay-Z became a household name. Chris did not chase credit. He chased outcomes. Conflict followed him, but so did opportunity. When DMX punched him during a misunderstanding, the streets expected retaliation. Chris considered it. Instead, the situation was transformed into business. Royalties replaced revenge. DMX's next album went triple platinum. Chris got paid. That was his signature move. In 1999, Violator, the album solidified his influence. It was no longer just management. It was a brand that artists wanted access to. Eventually, tensions with Def Jam leadership pushed Chris to step away. He took his relationships, his reputation, and his instincts with him. Executive roles followed. New partnerships formed. Then came the artist who defined his legacy. When 50 Cent was being rejected across the industry, Chris stayed patient. He believed in timing, in leverage, in positioning. The shady, aftermath deal changed everything. Get Rich or Die Tryin' did not just succeed. It rewrote the business model. Chris Lighty no longer just managed careers. He engineered ecosystems. Brand deals followed. Film projects. Sneakers. Video games. The Vitamin Water partnership became one of the most profitable endorsement deals hip-hop had ever seen. By the mid-2000s, he was named one of the most influential managers in the industry. Not because he demanded attention, but because nothing moved without him. And that level of control came with a cost few people ever saw. For someone who spent his life managing chaos, losing control was Chris Lighty's greatest fear. By the late 2000s, the industry he helped shape was no longer familiar. Physical sales were collapsing. Digital revenue was thinner. Deals required more work for less return. The margins that once protected him were shrinking. Then came the losses. In 2007, Chris entered a partnership with Hollywood power broker Michael Ovitz, hoping to push his clients deeper into film and television. When the results failed to materialize, Chris pulled out. Ovitz sued. Chris lost. Millions were gone, including legal fees. It was not just a financial hit. It was a blow to his confidence in expansion beyond music. Around the same time, another wound opened quietly. Chris had invested with Bernie Madoff. When the fraud collapsed, so did a significant portion of his wealth. Publicly, Chris minimized the damage. Privately, those close to him said it shook him deeply. Money he believed was secure had vanished overnight. Then the recession hit. Chris was forced to downsize. Employees were let go. Offices tightened. For a man who prided himself on taking care of people, these decisions weighed heavily. He carried guilt along with responsibility, rarely sharing the burden. At home, the pressure was no longer contained. His marriage to Veronica Lighty had become volatile. Arguments were frequent. Police had responded to incidents in the past, including a 2005 domestic dispute that resulted in Chris's arrest. Though charges were dropped, the record remained. Trust eroded. Tempers flared. Stability faded. By 2011, Veronica filed for divorce, then withdrew it days before Father's Day. On the surface, reconciliation. Underneath, unresolved tension. Friends later described Chris as exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. He had checked himself into a psychiatric facility in Connecticut the year before his death. He spoke openly with some friends about depression. About feeling responsible for too many lives. About pressure that never shut off. Financial stress continued to close in. Reports later surfaced of tax liabilities. Loans tied to failed ventures approaching their due dates. Credit issues. Banking disputes. Each problem alone was manageable. Together, they became relentless. Still, Chris kept working. He discussed future projects with 50 Cent. He explored new management opportunities. He spoke about tours, brands, and long-term plans. There were no signs of retreat. No public breakdown. 3 days before his death, he tweeted about the anniversary of Scott LaRock's murder. A reminder that violence, pressure, and loss had always been part of the culture he navigated. From the outside, Chris Lighty still looked in control. But control, like money, can disappear slowly. And sometimes, by the time anyone notices, it is already gone. When authorities announced that Chris Lighty had died by suicide, the official narrative moved fast. Too fast for many people who knew how carefully Chris lived his life. Within hours, the case was ruled closed. No extended investigation. No public follow-up. Just a conclusion. In the United States, especially within the hip-hop community, that conclusion was met with quiet disbelief. Chris Lighty was not just another executive. He was the problem solver. The man people called when situations went bad. When money disappeared. When relationships fell apart. For many, the idea that he would leave his children, his clients, and unfinished business without answers did not match the man they knew. 50 Cent was among the first to question the ruling publicly. He spoke about conversations they had just weeks earlier. About tours and deals still being planned. About a man who was under pressure, yes, but still moving forward. Chris's family went further. They questioned the investigation itself. Why were the movers in the house that day never formally questioned? Why were the nannies present not interviewed? Why was there no confirmed gunshot residue test conducted on Chris's hands? Why was DNA testing on the weapon never clearly completed? In America, a country deeply familiar with true crime narratives and investigative failures, those unanswered questions mattered. Media coverage reflected the divide. Some outlets focused on mental health, depression, and financial stress. Others highlighted the inconsistencies, the speed of the ruling, and the lack of forensic follow-through. Petitions circulated online calling for the case to be reopened. Independent investigators were hired. Requests were made to access evidence that remained untouched. According to those involved, those requests were ignored. Outside the United States, the public response was quieter, but within global hip-hop circles, the loss was deeply felt. Chris Lighty's influence stretched far beyond New York. From Europe to Asia, his work shaped how artists approached ownership and branding. What lingered was not just grief. It was discomfort. A sense that the story presented did not fully explain the ending. And in an industry built on narratives, silence became the loudest signal of all. In the end, Chris Lighty did not leave behind a single answer. He left a reflection. A reflection of what happens when one man becomes the backbone of an entire culture. When everyone leans on you. When every problem finds its way to your door. When strength becomes expectation, and expectation becomes burden. Chris Lighty was not famous for his voice. He was known for his judgment. He stood between artists and corporations. Between chaos and contracts. Between raw talent and generational wealth. Long before it became common, he taught hip-hop how to think beyond the next record. How to think in ownership, branding, and longevity. His influence is everywhere. In the way artists negotiate deals. In the way managers protect leverage. In the way hip-hop learned to value the people behind the scenes. When he died, the industry paused. At his funeral, rivals stood side by side. Legends showed up not for headlines, but for respect. For a man who had helped so many rise without ever asking to be seen. Yet the questions surrounding his final moments remain. Was it the cost of carrying too much for too long? Or was the truth lost in a system that chose speed over certainty? Some believe his death was the tragic result of depression and pressure inside an unforgiving industry. Others believe the investigation moved too fast, asked too few questions, and left too much unexplored. What everyone agrees on is this. Hip-hop lost one of its sharpest minds that day. In 2017, the documentary mogul, The Life and Death of Chris Lighty, tried to capture his story. Not to solve the mystery, but to honor the complexity. It reminded viewers that some lives cannot be reduced to a single conclusion. Chris Lighty was one of them. He lived in the pressure. He mastered the game. And he carried weight most people never saw. If this story made you reflect on the hidden cost of success, share your thoughts below. Do you believe the full truth has been told, or is there still more beneath the surface? And if you want to hear more stories about the people who shaped culture from the shadows, stay with us. These stories matter. And they deserve to be remembered.